Hello, I'm Locke, Meredith. I'd like to invite you to join me on the next Legal Lines, where my special guest is our United States Congressman, Garret. Garrett's going to talk to us about this amazing election America just went through, about the message he thinks the American people sent to the federal government, and that is less government and more freedom. The Republican Party now controls all the branches of the federal government, and it likewise controls the vast majority of the state legislatures and state governorships. So join us on the next Legal Lines with Congressman Garret.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith, and I have a Legal Lines tip for you. Remember, knowledge is power, and I want you to know if you're injured, Louisiana law grants you a variety of claims to make sure you're fully compensated. It's generally chopped up into several categories, the first being general damages. That's going to compensate you for your mental and physical pain and suffering, your scarring, disability, functional limitations, your loss of enjoyment of life. Also, it will compensate your family, frankly, for your loss of affection. It's called loss of consortium claim. Next category is specific damages. Those would be, say, for example, past and future lost wages, past and future medical expenses. You also have a claim sometimes for what's called punishment damages or punitive damages, typically only available when you're injured by a drunk party. Finally, you're entitled to legal interest from the date you file your lawsuit until you're paid and court costs. So my Legal Lines tip to you from me, Locke Meredith, make sure you know what your claims are.
This has been Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, welcome to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. I'm very pleased to do another show with our United States Congressman Garret Graves. Garret, thanks again for doing another show. Let's dive in. It's such an interesting time in terms of politics, but the recent election reflects kind of a dire mood of the electorate all over America. So I wanted to kind of do a show about the State of the Union of America, the United States of America, and then of the states. So, historic election. Tell me what your thoughts are.
You know, Locke, I had never run for office before when I started the campaign for Congress in 2014. What motivated me to finally run was just frustration, feeling underrepresented or not represented, feeling like I didn't have a voice, watching things that were happening in Washington and saying, who in the world are they doing this for?
Right.
Because it's not what's in our best interest.
And thinking we're a minority somehow.
Absolutely. And so I think this election was really the electorate, the public, the American public standing up and saying, enough is enough. This is not okay. You're not representing me or my best interest. And I think you saw really a resounding message from across the nation, from states that historically would not have voted the way that they did. So this isn't just a Republican and Democrat thing. This was very pervasive feeling or sentiment across the public, and it came out in state legislatures, it came out in governor's races, it came out in Congress, and it came out obviously in the White House.
And you know, you hear the country discussed as whether or not it's liberal or center right, but the fact is what you were just stating, the conservative party, if there is one these days, but more conservative certainly would be the Republican Party. They now control the presidency, they control the House in both chambers. They're going to have the largest number of appointments to the United States Supreme Court, and they now control the largest majority of governorships and their state legislatures in history.
Yeah.
So clearly a message is being sent, and you were probably a tip of an arrow like a lot of folks were. I saw Governor Jeb Bush just proposed a convention of Congress to do some constitutional amendments. What are your thoughts in that regard?
Look, it's actually something I talked about in 2014. I think that changes do need to be made. The one thing I'd caution is that we do need to make sure, and you noted the layout of legislators and governors, but we do need to make sure that if we open it up, we make sure that we have sideboards on it. Don't let things get out of control. But look, you know, when the Constitution was signed, there were about 4 million Americans. Today, there's over 320 million people here. And to continue to try and govern this nation using a one-size-fits-all approach out of Washington is flawed, it's failed. And think about it, where do you see the most frustration? You see the most frustration coming out in the big differences of opinion in many social issues and things along those lines. Mm-hmm. Let states decide those. Let counties and parishes decide this. Don't have Washington, D.C. come dictate down to Louisiana what we're going to do. And the reality is, looking at the dozens and dozens of members of Congress from California, they have more control over Louisiana than our own delegation does.
It's nuts.
It is.
Absolutely. Well, you know, and what we're stating is so important, because what's happened since our foundation, in my view, is that what you were stating, we have top-down control. We have very few individuals who have, what, 5 out of 9 folks control the Supreme Court. One president controls that branch. You got a very few in the leadership control the House and on the Senate side. And they make the law for everybody. 330 million, 20 million people, and there might be 20 of them.
And Locke, think about it. So the population of Louisiana was roughly, the population of Louisiana today is roughly the population of the entire country when the Constitution was signed. Phenomenal document.
Right.
But I do think it could use a revision and updating and certainly clearly delegating more power and authority to states and local units of government to tailor solutions to the people that live in those communities.
So the provisions that you would focus on, because there was also this idea of a convention of the states that's been circulating and seems to be going pretty strong. But the big issues there that I've seen where they're putting those perimeters, where these are the only issues we're discussing, is term limits in Congress. You got term limits on the president and perhaps term limits on the Supreme Court. Some form of accountability because they're there for life. What other considerations do you think?
Look, I think, again, strengthening some of the provisions related to state authorities and state autonomy is something that's key. Ideas like when states vote for certain provisions, that you can't have the federal government coming in and telling them no, provided that there are not federal implications. You've got to recognize more power, authority, respect for states' rights, and for self-determination.
And as I recall, the Supreme Court has used the Commerce Clause, I think, to broaden the jurisdiction of the federal government by taking it away from the states when that's not what was intended.
And so what it does is it makes people feel, as I talked about before, voiceless, underrepresented, and you see decisions coming out of Washington that aren't in the best interest of the people of South Louisiana.
And then you've got the balanced budget issue. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, I do. I think the fact that you have a debt that's approaching $20 trillion, $160,000 plus per taxpayer, it's
That's
an
absurd.
Inexcusable figure. And the reality is, when you look at the expenditures of government, it's not like you're looking around and saying, oh, these were all appropriate expenditures. You're seeing superfluous, low priority things that are, and just money just
Fraud.
being wasted. You're completely wasted, fraudulent spending. And it'd be one thing if you were spending it on true priorities. They're not. And so balanced budget needs to happen.
And of course, in Louisiana, we have a requirement of a balanced budget, and that's why they're cutting like crazy right now.
I'm a big proponent of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution.
All right, so let's talk about the debt, because it's such a huge amount of money. You pointed out that in what, 160 grand per person.
Per taxpayer, yeah.
If you really consider that 50% are the ones who pay the taxes out of our population, is more like $320 per person. That ought to scare you. So how do we change it?
You know, the way that it needs to be approached is that you've got all these automatic spending programs and legacy programs that have been appropriated for decades and decades. In 1940s, 1950s, they might have made a lot of sense. 2016, they don't. You've got way too much duplication, fraud, and waste in government. And going through program by program and reevaluating the efficacy of those investments, is it truly a priority today? Are there better ways, more efficient ways of doing it? We can get to a balanced budget without the pain that some people predict.
Well, and if you delegate back the power that states had that the feds took from them, the feds wouldn't have the obligation and responsibility and the money, frankly, that they're supposed to spend on those areas. The states would deal with it, right?
Absolutely. And you could, just like we've talked about in the past, about the inefficiency of FEMA responses and others, there are better ways of running many programs if you simply allowed the local governments and state governments to tailor their programs to their actual problems in their state.
All right, so let's talk about the economy, because the economy is kind of like the big umbrella on top of all these little, and we have been a meager 1, sometimes 0, average maybe 2% growth rate in America for what, almost 8 years? How do we change that?
Well, I think that's a chord that Trump really hit during the election, talking about how we've got to do a better job having a fairer economy, not stopping the overburdening of the U.S. worker as opposed to what's happening in China, India, Brazil, and these other countries. We've got to create a fairer economic climate to where these companies aren't going to be incentivized because of our tax, our environmental, and our labor policies to go locate across the border in Mexico, to go overseas to China and other countries.
And they've done it.
Oh, they absolutely
Big boys have done it.
They absolutely. And when you look at the cost of doing businesses in these other countries compared to here, it's a no-brainer in some cases. And that should not happen, and it doesn't have to happen. we can have a fairer economy in the United States. And again, I think it's going to really be a big priority for President Trump.
All right, we'll continue this in the next segment. This is Locke Meredith with my special guest, our United States Congressman, Garret Graves. We'll be right back.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. Pleased to have back on the show our United States Congressman Garret Graves. Garret, let's dive back in. We now got a President Trump on board. I think January 20 is the big day. So what's he going to do based on what you've kept up with?
Well, you know, we've talked about the fact that this last election was a pretty big expression of frustration from the American public. And I think Trump really hit that chord of frustration.
Right.
And I think with his business background, with his development background, he's going to be turning the country in a different direction, recognizing that the tax code penalizes United States businesses disproportionately, which affects our ability to get jobs and economic activity. Understanding that the regulatory environment here, all of these crazy regulations that you're putting in regard to labor and environment and other things, they actually cost money and take jobs away from us. Absolutely billions. And it's gotten much worse under President Obama than under other administrations. And so I think really recognizing that there are costs associated with that, that's penalizing our economy, and taking his experience from business background and applying it to government. I'll tell you, growing up, you know, we had family small businesses, my brothers and sisters. I grew up in one with my parents. Recognizing the cost of regulation and how you do have to cut positions. It literally takes jobs away to comply with federal regulations.
Well, and Garret, I read that, I mean, his folks are trying to pump them out like 25 a day right now, but I understand we've got a safety provision law out there that's going to be used. Explain to the folks.
Yeah, the Congressional Review Act does allow us to come back and effectively rescind regulations that President Obama has put in place if we think they're inappropriate, because they're not cost effective, they're not consistent with the authority the law provides. In some cases we found that they've pulled these laws up from the 1920s or even older and written a new regulation today trying to apply it to today's world and today's technology. And so we have the ability to rescind those. What's happened in the past few months when we've done it is that the president has vetoed our effort to rescind the regulation. But when President Trump comes in, obviously he's going to support some of those efforts in Congress to repeal these regulations and bring us back to a fairer economy, a fairer environment where we can operate more competitively with other countries.
So the way I'm reading this, he's going to put money or leave money in the pockets of business and individuals so they spend the money efficiently and effectively in the way they want to, instead of the government spending the way we just talked about for the last 30 minutes, how we've seen FEMA and the federal government do inefficiently and ineffectively.
Absolutely. And Locke, look, you've got to keep in mind that regulations effectively are taxes.
Right.
If you suddenly have to comply with new regulations and provide more benefits or provide certain safety protocols in your office, that costs money. That
and you're going to get fined.
Is a tax. And so, you know, because the president hasn't been able to raise taxes, he's done this backdoor way of raising taxes by pushing this aggressive regulatory environment.
So I've also read that President Trump-elect is going to introduce around a $500 million infrastructure program. What are your thoughts in that regard?
Well, look, there's no question that additional infrastructure investment is needed, whether it be in flood protection and roads and other things. I think we've got to question very carefully, one, where's this coming from? How is it being paid for? And number two, are we going to continue to try and implement these through organizations like the Corps of Engineers, which couldn't build something to save their life, or are we going to find better ways of doing it to where you can have local governments, local contractors more involved to make these projects happen faster, more efficiently, and of course keeping the money in local communities.
Well, and it's interesting too, because I'm seeing a consideration of whether private money is going to be used or public money is going to be used. Like they're considering doing
These
more
P3s
toll
and
roads, and you got the Keystone Pipeline, where you have private monies being invested to create an infrastructure that really supports our entire nation.
All right. Which goes back to the whole competitive environment. Are people willing to spend money here, or they want to go spend money in other countries?
And it'll be also probably more efficiently and effectively done. Shift gears real quick. Let's talk about security and immigration, because that's another big issue that President-elect Trump campaigned on. What are your thoughts? He's talking about all kinds of stuff.
Look, the sentiments that he has expressed, I think, relate to the frustrations people have felt, that people feel that there's not enough being done to secure our borders, that the laws aren't being enforced in regard to illegal immigrants, that people know we're here are being allowed to stay here and aren't being deported. And then the other component of that I think is important is reforming our legal immigration process. But we've got to secure our borders, we've got to enforce the laws that are on the books and not pick and choose which laws we're going to follow and which ones we're not. And we've got to reform this legal immigration process that's such a mess.
And of course, I'm sure a lot of folks know that President Obama used executive orders to try and effectuate a lot of policies that would allow certain immigration to occur that was maybe not allowed by law. Certainly it's been held that way by the lower courts. And President Trump, as I understand it, when he takes office, will be able, because they're executive orders, to what?
He would be able to rescind those, and of course the courts have found in many cases that some of the executive actions of the Obama administration regarding immigration were illegal, went beyond their authority, and those are continuing to go through the courts today. But I think that President-elect Trump has made it crystal clear that illegal immigrants are going to be sent back. A lot of our law enforcement community that I've met with have been very frustrated, including the Border Protection agents frustrated that their hands are being tied.
And as I understand, there's going to be an initial focus, at least my understanding is that on the criminal aspect of illegals, because let's face it, it's, you know, at
Let's
least
get the bad apples out.
Ton of millions of folks here, but we need the bad ones gone first. So let's talk about the offense. Do you think that's going to happen, or what's the definition of offense?
Yeah, you know, I think that's a good question. You know, in some cases, some type of structure probably makes a lot of sense in areas where you can effectively block illegal immigrants by using a structure.
But that ain't going to work in a river.
It's not going to work everywhere, and I don't think there's one solution that's going to work everywhere. You're going to have to use some means of electronic protections, things like cameras, sensors, and other things. You're going to have to use some of our intelligence assets, our Defense Department, and others, to not just our soldiers, but some of their technologies to truly secure and protect our border. You can't tell me, you know, that President Obama has said that we can't secure the border, it's impossible, it's too porous. You can't tell me that the American military can't protect the United States from a southern border. I don't believe that. So we can protect it. We're going to have to employ all those assets.
Let's shift to the kind of the security side of this, because we're talking about there's an economic consequence to illegal immigrants coming in, also not to mention just breaking the law, but there's also a security component to that, and we are under a terrorist attack constantly that most of us don't have a clue about. What do we do about this?
Well, look, there is clear evidence that some folks that want to carry out attacks on the United States have attempted to come into the United States, and in some cases have come into the United States illegally through the southern border. It is a very real, valid concern that we need to secure our borders. We need to distinguish the United States from Mexico. And we know that from some of our activities in the Middle East and elsewhere that the terrorists know that is a porous border and a way to get into the United States without being tracked, and can come carry out harm to our citizens here.
How is our legislature group going to do with the new Trump? I know Senator Vitter's retiring. I know. I assume that you're supporting the Republican U.S. Senate John Kennedy candidate.
Certainly plan to vote for him. It looks like our delegation is going to be 2 Republican senators. It looks like we're going to have likely 5 out of our 6 members of Congress will be Republicans as well. So I think based upon that, having better relationships with the White House than we've had over the past 8 years is going to be a step in the right direction for our state.
Garrett, fantastic news. Thank you. Appreciate it. This is Locke, Meredith with Legal Lines. Our special guest, United States Congressman Garret Graves. Thanks for being with us.
It's time now for Legal Lines Tips with your host, Locke Meredith.
Hello, I'm Locke Meredith with a Legal Lines tip for you. Document your claim. What do I mean? Whenever you present a claim, whether it's for injuries in an automobile collision or for a breach of contract case or a business claim, it all boils down to documentation and evidence. For example, when you go to trial, basically both sides are presenting their evidence of what they believe to be their case. For example, also, if you're involved in an automobile collision, document the event. Talk to all the parties who are involved. Get their names, address, contact information, insurance info. Talk to the witnesses on the scene. Also get their contact information. Take photographs. With the phones we all have these days, everybody can take a picture and that paints 1,000 words. So document your claim. The Legal Lines tip from me, Locke, Meredith, to you is document the claim.
This has been Legal Lines Tips.
Hello, welcome back to Legal Lines. I'm Locke Meredith. A little change up here. I've got my partner Sean Fagan, and we're going to talk about the consequences of the election from a legal standpoint. We were just talking with our Congressman Garret, and he was giving us kind of a political analysis of the meaning of the election. Let's talk about the legal consequences. Sean, now you have one party, that is the Republican Party, in control at the federal level of the presidency, of both houses of Congress, and very shortly will appoint at least a 5-4 more conservative Supreme Court majority. What's your analysis?
Well, we've got three branches of government. We've got the judicial branch, which is influenced by the legislative as well as the executive. The executive appoints to the Supreme Court, and the legislative then affirms the appointment. So at this point, we'd look at it and say if things go the way you'd expect with a conservative House, conservative Senate, and a Republican president, you would expect to see a conservative go into the Supreme Court, which right now with Justice Scalia having passed away.
And being the most conservative.
Yes, being the most conservative, there wouldn't be much of a shift on the Supreme Court you wouldn't expect if a conservative is appointed there.
Right now they're having split decisions, and so pretty much nothing's changing based on what the lower courts did. But once we have the 9 justices on the court, typically you had the 4 liberals, the 4 conservatives, with Justice Kennedy kind of being the swing guy going back and forth. So we'll return to that dynamic with a decision coming out of the Supreme Court, probably affecting in some way, form, or fashion the law. Let's talk about the fact that it's not just that guaranteed appointment that's going to likely occur. Let's talk about the fact that if he's there during a period of time where another justice or 2 passes away or retires, likely we'll get a similar type of candidate proposed. And as you noted, the Senate has to give its consent and approval to the president's nomination. Tell the folks how that is affected with this election.
Well, what's interesting is the history that led to this election. When President Obama was trying to pass the Affordable Care Act, the Obamacare Act, as some people call it, one of the things they did is they did away with the filibuster.
Meaning Senator Harry Reid, who is the majority leader of the Senate.
That's right. At that time, the Democrats had control. And so they did away with the filibuster, which was designed to impede the progress of certain things that were being done by the majority. So it allowed for more discussion.
Requires 60 votes to pass instead of 51.
Correct. And which actually is another issue, the majority issue, what constituted a majority. So now with the filibuster gone, and the idea that 51 is all you need to affirm from the Senate side, the nuclear option now has become something that's going to help with the Supreme Court nominees from the Republican side.
And they didn't use the nuclear option. It was the Democrats that used the nuclear option.
Correct.
But now, I guess the tables have turned, and it's going to be used in the same fashion that the Democrats did, and will likely result in a more conservative court.
That's right. And what they did is they changed the rules of the Senate. And because the Democrats were in control, when they changed those rules, they did it in a way that would allow them to pass the Obamacare, but it was
with their majority.
It's more short-sighted. So now it's going to change up the dynamics of the Supreme Court appointments for sure.
And of course that raises in some folks' eyes the specter, so to speak, of formerly close decisions, a 5-4 decision, being reviewed by a new court in the future that's more conservative. And those typical decisions would be abortion, it would be the marriage decision, it could be affirmative action, any number of issues that will maybe be reconsidered.
That's right. And all those issues have been fluxed, but the marriage issue, of course, is the hot topic
Recently,
debate right
for sure.
now. And so, yeah, for the LGBT community, who sits in the Supreme Court and how they think is going to be determinative of whether or not they're going to be considered to be a protected class, like race, gender, and other ones, or whether or not they're going to be like everybody else and not a
Right.
protected class.
Let's talk about the executive order, because that is the way that President Obama would, when he couldn't get the Congress to agree to what he wanted to do, he would try and affect policy by writing an order, and he did that for certain immigration purposes and other purposes over the last 8 years. The consequence of using that is what?
Well, that's huge. I mean, it's the first president that's really done it to the degree that it's been done in the last 8 years. So what you've taken is, when the rationale was that, well, Congress is not really working fast enough, or they're
We're not working with
frozen.
him, not agreeing with him.
And so he essentially wrote law that could be done at the executive level. It means he executed certain things that he wanted done without legislative oversight.
And what's so interesting now is President Trump, because they are executive orders that did not involve Congress in the process, President Trump can, with the stroke of a pen, eliminate them and completely reverse in 1 second that policy that was tried to be implemented by President Obama. Thus the reason why it's always better for the president to work with a Congress who's accountable to the people on a much more regular basis, and then the law cannot be changed like that. An order can be changed by the signature of a pen, but a law cannot be changed. It requires the whole Congress to reconsider it and the president to sign it again. Big deal.
Well, it is, because you're looking at the different, it's kind of the equivalent of what happened in Congress with getting rid of the filibuster and the majority vote. It's a short-sighted deal when you start using executive orders the way they were used. They were not intended to reach as far as they've reached, which sets, in some ways, a precedent for the next president to do things that, from my standpoint, at least as a lawyer, you just say that's not the way the legislative branch and executive branch were supposed to interact.
It's interesting, too. I read this week that Governor Bush, Jeb Bush, recently was recommending a convention of Congress to address 3 main issues. And that was the issue of term limits for Congress, the jurisdictional basis for the federal government to take over state powers, which is the Commerce Clause primarily, and then a balanced budget. And of course, we've discussed, and I've had a guest on, Dale Cleary, where there was a convention of the states contemplating to do the exact same thing. Important.
Oh, it's huge, because because you've got one party that now controls the legislative branch and the executive branch. If a majority comes into the Supreme Court that thinks in a conservative fashion and is applying the Constitution in an originalist way, the way Justice Scalia did, you could pretty much anticipate that balanced budget, if it passes, and all these different things would pass muster with the Supreme Court as well.
Let's talk about kind of the meaning of the election. It seems that, given the fact that the Republican one party has taken over, sends a message: we want Congress and the president to work, we want less government, less taxes, and we want more freedom. Also, as I understand it, the Republican Party has taken over a vast majority of the legislatures at the state level and governorships.
Yeah, so across the country you're seeing more and more of the conservative bent, which has happened actually worldwide. So you're starting to see with even Brexit and these other issues that are happening in Great Britain and England, those things are now starting to be seen in many different countries.
So the bottom line is, it looks like this election is sending a big signal both on the federal and the state level, and as a result, hopefully, our government at the federal level will become more accountable to the people.
Yeah, want to be more responsive, you know.
Sean, appreciate it. Thank you very much. This is Locke, Meredith Legal Lines. My guest, Sean Fagan, my law partner. Thank you for being with us.